Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about exercise selection if your goal is to gain muscle as quickly as possible using the most efficient exercises possible. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Alright guys, what I'm going to do is create the argument here for why the front squat and the deficit deadlift are probably your best choices for general hypertrophy as far as squat and deadlift variations go. And what I want people to understand, I'm not saying people can't get big, can't get strong using back squats, even low bar squats, conventional deadlifts, sumo deadlifts, whatever. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. What I'm saying is if you're trying to fine-tune stuff, if you wanted to gain muscle as quickly as possible, you're trying to gain just a couple more percentages per month or year, these might be superior. And I'm not talking about for the rank novice, because these variations actually have slightly smaller margin of error. They require sometimes a stronger core. They're slightly harder to learn. Okay, the novice should still probably start with a back squat and a conventional deadlift. But a couple of points I want to make have to do with basically compressive stress recovery versus muscle growth stimulated. Alright, one of the things that needs to be noted, both of these exercises are oftentimes longer range of motion than the other variations. Obviously the deficit deadlift has the longest range of motion, again depending on how big of a deficit you create. It is a longer range of motion than a conventional deadlift. Right? I think everyone universally agrees on that one. Not a point of contention, no debate there, right? We all understand that. We all understand that. Alright, the front squat is oftentimes a deeper version of the squat. It's usually equal to people's high bar squat, but definitely if you're a low bar squatter, it's a longer range of motion version. Alright, also not really subject to debate. I generally believe longer range of motion lifts are better for muscle growth stimulation. Why? Because they're usually easier to recover from. They usually end up putting less strain on joints for the same amount of workload, because you have to move a weight further. You end up doing more work with slightly less weight, or equal work with slightly less weight. In this case, there's going to be specifics involved. Now, when we talk about the front squat, why the front squat? Simply put, most people use about 20% less weight on the front squat. Now, a lot of people say, well, doesn't it have different muscle activation than the back squat? Yeah, slightly. Slightly. And there have been a few studies done on this where they took people and tried to study it the best they can. On average, most people front squat about 20% less than their back squat. Here's what they found though with some of this. What has been found is that muscle activation is pretty similar. The glutes get about the same amount of activation. The hamstrings get slightly less. The quads, at least two of the quads, get slightly more, and the muscles in the back seem to get slightly more activation, particularly the thoracic region. Now, the thoracic region of the back is a weak link for many people on their deadlift. In fact, since we're going to use these two, if you're using these two as your primary lower body exercises, remember, a lot of deadlifters who do deadlift competition only, who do not do full power meets, even in powerlifting, use the front squat instead of the back squat. Why? Because they find it's a better accessory for their deadlift. It makes them better at deadlifting than the back squat does. Although the back squat can increase your squat, front squat is a good accessory for it. The best squat version for improving your deadlift. So there's going to be some synergy here if you're also deadlifting. That's an important factor, because synergy between your lifts that makes you stronger at different lifts is going to bring up your overall tonnages quicker. Okay, and if your overall tonnages can come up quicker, you're going to get bigger faster. And tonnages means, you know, how much workload you're doing, how much total workload you're doing. In other words, if the front squat increases your deadlift 10% faster than the back squat does, you're going to be deadlifting more soon, which again is going to increase your overall size. But the thing is, yeah, it works slightly less hamstring, slightly more quad, slightly more back, similar glute activation. This is the best they can determine in studies in biomechanics and EMG and everything else. It's not perfect, but that's what they come up with. And these differences are fairly small, but it puts far less compressive stress on the knee joints. All right, it also puts less compressive stress on the spine. Axial loading is an enormous factor in recovery. If you're working the muscles the exact same, you're getting the exact same rough amount of total muscle stimulation, therefore you're growing equally, but you take a variation of the exercise that reduces axial loading 20%, the recovery difference is enormous. Recovery difference is enormous there, right? So if you're speeding up full body recovery more quickly, that means you can perform the exercises more often. Well, being able to perform an exercise more often is worth more muscle growth. What do we know from various studies? If you can train a muscle 3 times a week, it usually grows faster than if you can train it twice. Well, that includes exercises. What we've also noted, remember the Norwegian study that had people performing some of the lifts 6 times a week with the same weekly volume gained more muscle. They gained more muscle than the groups who did the same volume spread over 3 workouts instead of 6. So twice as much volume per workout. And normally we would say about 3 times a week should stimulate maximum muscle growth. That's not what was found. At least in these experienced drug-tested lifters. They found that the 6 day a week produced more muscle growth. Well, that's pretty important here to consider. The ability to perform exercises more frequently because you recover faster is definitely worth hypertrophy. If you're trying to gain muscle as quickly as possible, I'm not talking about just gaining muscle. I mean, you could do an exercise once a week and gain muscle. All right, you can do an exercise once a week and gain muscle. But the ability to perform your same workloads again more frequently is worth measurable amounts of extra muscle. All right, you recover faster. Front squat is a much faster recovering exercise, and it puts less compressive stress on the knees. Again, less compressive stress on the knees equals what? That's going to recover more quickly. You're less likely to have knee problems. That's a big deal for long term in a training program. I'm not saying squats are bad for your knees, but comparing the two, you're getting less compressive stress. Okay, and that saves you the ability to put more compressive stress on everything with the deadlift. The deadlift activates more muscle fibers through the whole body than the squat, so you're not going to be cutting into your recovery as much with the squat. All right, so why the deficit deadlift? And not everyone should do the deficit deadlift. Some people who have really short arms are already doing a deficit deadlift. I'm talking about people with average length or above average length arms, not T-Rex arm people. T-Rex arm people are doing a deficit deadlift every time they pull. Now in my case, you guys saw the video I put up yesterday. I'm wearing 1-inch thick work boots, right? 1-inch thick heels on my boots. And I'm standing on a 1.5-inch plate. So I have a 2.5-inch deficit deadlift there. Now normally I train in the boots anyways most of the time these days. But so that's a 2.5-inch deficit. Now, when you're doing that, you're having to pull the weight from a longer range of motion on the deadlift. Longer range of motion generally recruits more muscle fibers. Now, in this case, it doesn't add more muscle fiber recruitment from the back. Deficit deadlifts from that difference probably stimulate very, very similar amounts of back hypertrophy and overall back development. And even if it was slightly less, a hair less, you're getting a hair more from your front squats. It balances out. All right, it balances out. Same thing, we go over the deficit deadlifts. They work the hamstrings and the quads to some extent slightly more, but the hamstrings and the glutes get worked harder on the deficit deadlift. All right, so it allows for more complete lower body development because you're pulling it through a longer range of motion, and those muscles have to work harder coming out of the bottom. But you have to reduce the weight. You have to reduce the weight. Anywhere between, it depends, 5%, 10%, usually closer to 5%. It's 5% less axial loading to stimulate the same if it's the amount of overall muscle growth, and probably slightly more in the hamstrings and glutes in your posterior chain. But you're doing so with less axial loading, and you're doing so with less compressive stress on the knee joints. All right? So if that's what you're doing, you're going to recover faster. Your joints are going to recover slightly more quickly, and your entire nervous system will recover more quickly. Axial loading does put a lot of stress on the nervous system. All right, so the same thing. What we've done, we've reduced axial loading, we've reduced recovery, and we've enhanced overall size. Because if you compare the two, you end up with slightly better quad development. All right, the hamstring gets traded off because the deadlift's a better hamstring exercise than the squat anyways. You've chosen the variation of the deadlift that's going to give you more hamstring and glute, which it really is going to be your primary builder over your squats for that. Slightly better overall mid-back development. better core development. But you're going to recover more quickly from both exercises. You're going to recover more quickly, which means you can train again more often. Or you can at least not feel as exhausted and not as tired as you go about your day. So, from a total maximum hypertrophy perspective, these exercises actually have more potential than their standard variations. Alright, these are, if you were to do this is my opinion, what people should be leaning in the direction of if their goal is to gain size as quickly as possible. It's not always about how much weight you use to achieve your tonnage, it's how you move the weight. How far you move it, what you do with it is what matters. Alright, otherwise everyone would just be doing partial reps to lift the most weight possible, and we know that doesn't work. It sounds good in theory, and some people claim it works. It doesn't work. So that's the reason I suggest these two, and so hopefully that makes a lot of sense to people who don't understand why. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.